of Cornell University.
Hopefully we're going to finish off pH today, and we're going to talk about buffering, and then we're going to talk about some control, some sort of liming controls and stuff like that. But I want to finish off last lecture because I didn't get all the way through buffering, and I wanted to, because it's a fairly important process, and certainly from a soil management perspective, it's extremely important process. But in general, just from issues of nutrients and things like that, buffering is a really, it's a driver for a lot of the reactions that are going on in soils. Certain pHs, or I should say nutrients, have certain availability dependent on different pHs, and if you have a buffering capacity or the ability of soils to resist pH change, that's going to have an effect upon the availability of the nutrients. And so I started talking about buffering with this slide because when we're talking about buffering, we're talking about controlling or managing, perhaps that's not the right word, but controlling all of the pHs. We're not just controlling this active pH. Yes, this is the pH that we measure, and this is the one that controls the availability of nutrients in a sense, but because all of these different pools of pH are in equilibrium, when you want to control the pH of your soils, this is what you're interested in, but you have to also be aware that because of this exchange, you really are controlling these two pools as well. Okay? Now, I started with looking at this because this is actually something we looked at last lecture when I was on this board over here. But the size of that reserve, or that's another way of saying that the size of the cation exchange capacity is going to have a huge impact on the salt replaceable or the exchangeable pH pool. Does that make sense? Okay. The larger the CEC and the more bases or the less bases, the larger the base saturation, the more exchange I'm going to have between these two pools. Okay. If this is a very small CEC, cation exchange capacity, and it has a very low base saturation, most of the cation exchange sites are going to be occupied by aluminums or protons, which even if I have exchange, it's going to be a proton for a proton, right? On the other hand, if I have a high base saturation, I start having calciums and sodiums and things like that, magnesium in these cation exchange sites, when the proton exchanges, I'm going to get something other than a proton coming out. And so that's going to affect the pH in this active pool. Does that make sense? Question?
Why when there's a low CEC and low base saturation is aluminum on that surface?
Why? Say that. So why when there's a low base saturation
And low CEC,
on
the surface of the...
Oh, right. It's not necessarily just because I have low CEC or high CEC doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be aluminums on these exchange sites. But once I start getting down to low pHs, all the other bases are gone, and what's really left is aluminum and protons. Okay? Aluminum will be rinsed out of the system as well, but because aluminum doesn't react to reduce the acidity as the other bases do, because aluminum, you put aluminum into a solution and it actually increases acidity. Until you get down to really low pHs. Which brought us to this issue of a slide like this, where I had three different treatments. Okay? One treatment was a treatment with a high base saturation, high CEC. Another treatment was a soil that had a low CEC. And the third treatment was water, where there's no CEC whatsoever. Okay? And imagine that the low CEC and the high CEC, both of those soils have high base saturation. Let's imagine they have 100% base saturation. It doesn't really matter. Okay? But what does matter is the amount of protons that you're adding. Okay? If I have a soil that has a high base saturation and has a high CEC, it has a huge amount of resistance to pH change, because as those protons start taking away the bases that are on the cation exchange, exchanging for them, I'm going to have a very large pool of bases here. Now, if I have a smaller pool, i.e. a low CEC, even with 100% base saturation, I'm going to have less bases that can exchange. So my resistance to pH change is going to be greatly reduced. And then in the third scenario, this scenario right here, which is water, basically every proton I add is going to increase acidity. There's nothing to exchange. It can't exchange on any of those exchange sites. Every hydroxide I add is going to raise the pH. It's a one-to-one correspondence. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, there are controls on this change in pH at different pHs. Now that sounds strange. Okay? There are different controls on the buffering at different pHs. Okay? At the mid-level, between basically 4.5 to 7.5, because there are a lot of bases still on these cation exchange sites, the bases themselves act as a buffer to pH change. I start adding protons out here. Those protons are going to exchange with the bases. The bases are going to go into solution, and the active pH is not going to change all that much. Does that make sense? Now, I could also add bases over here. If I start adding bases, the assumption is, well, the pH is going to go up. No. The bases are going to start exchanging with the protons, and the proton's going to get back in to the active soil solution. And so they're resisting change. Yes, there will be a change in pH, but it won't be as dramatic as if I was doing it in water. Does that make sense to everybody? And that control is strictly associated with the cation exchange. It's with those bases, the base saturations on those cation exchange sites. Okay? Now, when we start getting at the extremes, the high pHs and the low pHs, there are two other controls. At the high pHs, this is where we ended up last lecture. At the high pHs, you're really looking at calcium carbonate. Okay, so do you guys remember this equation right here? CO2 plus water makes carbonic acid, right? Okay, now this is a reversible reaction. This reaction can go this way. Now, at high pHs, we're really at this component of the pH reaction. Okay, so at high pHs, we have a soil solution or a soil. Here's my soil, all right? And in this soil is calcium carbonate. Right? Now, if I start to acidify this system, I'm going to be adding protons to it, right? What's going to happen? This reaction right here. Here's my calcium carbonate, and here's my acid. So for every 2 protons that I add into my calcium carbonate enriched environment, those 2 protons are basically going to knock the calcium off. One of those protons is going to bind with the carbonate, and one of those protons are going to be in solution. So for every calcium carbonate I have, for every 2 protons that are added, it's going to neutralize one of them. It's not going to prevent acidification, but it's going to slow it down. Does that make sense? Questions? Go.
I have a question about the last slide. If I heard correctly, you said that you add bases to the solution and then they interchange with protons. But if you add base cations, you acidify the soil?
In a sense, this buffering action, so the question is, he didn't basically understand when he started adding bases what's happening. Okay? So this reaction is totally reversible. If I add protons and I have a high base saturation, those protons are going to knock the bases off their exchange complexes, and it's going to remove a proton from the soil solution for every exchange, right? So as a result, the active pool, the active acidity, is resisting pH change. Okay? I keep driving it down, protons, add more and more protons, and sooner or later I'm going to get really low pHs. Now let's turn the scenario around. I've got the low pHs. Now I'm going to start throwing bases in. Well, those bases are going to go into the solution. What are they going to do? They're going to equilibrate with cation exchange sites. If they do that, and the cation exchange sites are dominated by protons, what's going to be coming off with the exchanges? Predominantly, it's going to be protons. And so every base that I throw in, it exchanges, in all likelihood, a proton is going to be coming out. So it's actually going to resist the raise in the pH because I keep throwing protons back into solution for every base that I'm throwing into solution. Does that make sense? Okay? All right. So there was another question here on this one. Was there not? We feel comfortable with this? All right. So let's actually start talking about aluminum. Now, this is at the low pH. This happens at the high pHs. This happens at the low pHs. Okay? And this is this slide, which I know everybody just loved. Okay? Remember this slide? This is the slide that was talking about how we get protons in solution. Okay, let's start here again. Aluminum, it's a part of the structure. Okay, protons go into solution and they start dissolving this clay micelle. Aluminum goes into solution. Okay, and I've got a smaller clay micelle. Okay, if I am at this scenario down here with these high acidity, I'm putting aluminum into soil solution. The aluminum is probably not going to do that much. Okay, at low pH is high concentration of acidity, high concentrations of protons. Aluminum is basically sitting all by itself in +3. Okay, so we have a low pH. In fact, the pH probably lower than 5. Now, what's going to happen when I start trying to raise or change the pH? What's going to happen when I start adding hydroxide? This aluminum is going to bind with that hydroxide to make aluminum OH plus 2. Okay, so it's literally going to take that aluminum out of the soil solution. All right, let's go back over here and take a look at this. Same soil, but in this soil, I have an enrichment of aluminum. Okay? And into that soil solution, we're going to be adding hydroxide. I want to raise the pH. Now, we will talk about where that comes from in a moment. But in essence, to raise the pH, I need to add hydroxide. Well, what is this going to do? This is going to react with that. Okay? And I'm going to get OH minus. This OH is going to combine, and what's going to happen is I'm going to get this. In essence, I've taken that OH out of the soil solution, which means I'm resisting pH change. This aluminum, by combining with this, is taking it out of the soil solution, and therefore it's resisting the pH change. Does that make sense? Now, okay, so I'm going to add 2 of these. I'm going to add another one. I add another hydroxide, OH. This combines with this. And in essence, I've neutralized another hydroxide in the soil solution. I'm resisting the raise in the pH. I do another one. It will combine with the aluminum over here, make aluminum hydroxide. In essence, this one aluminum neutralized 1, 2, 3 hydroxides. It's buffering the pH. It's resisting the rise in the pH. Go.
So this diagram suggests that it's taking the hydroxides from water molecules?
This diagram is designed to show both directions. Okay, so we get up to here. This is the Gibbsite form. Okay, if I've been adding hydroxide again and again and again, okay, what you really should think of is this, the proton, what's being released out as the hydroxide. This one, the proton's being released. Okay? But what you're looking at here is we've driven from here with a hydroxide to here, with a hydroxide to here, with a hydroxide to here.
Right, but if the hydroxide is coming from the H2O, then how is it buffering? Isn't it not? It's not affecting.
In this scenario, this is the whole reaction. I'm just showing you part of the reaction. Okay? Now, we could do this the other way around, because this, in fact, will help. This, in fact, will help to buffer the reaction the other way as well. Okay? So what happens when I start throwing protons into the soil solution? Hydroxide gets stripped off, turns into water, and we now have that. So the proton, in essence, has been neutralized. So let's throw the scenario the other way. I start throwing protons in here. The byproduct of that proton, let's show the whole equation, is water, and I now have that. Completely reversible. I do it again with a proton. Oops. Proton makes water. I've neutralized another one. I can do it one more time. Proton, aluminum. So in essence, this, depending upon what pH you are in, this guy can reduce or neutralize 3 hydroxides as it moves up and 3 protons as it moves down in pH. And the pKa that you're seeing here is the approximate pH at which this happens. So this buffering reaction is happening someplace around 6.5 to about someplace around 4.7, 4.5. Okay? So the buffering reaction in this case is the lower ends. It's bracketing this zone.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.